Welcome to the season premiere of Unleashed Learning TV. Now, if you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of chaos or uncertainty that continues to take place, or if you're starting to think about what teaching in a post-COVID world might look like, we have a special guest for you. Since 1966, Margaret Wheatley has worked globally in many different roles: a speaker, teacher, community worker, consultant, advisor, and formal leader. She's the best-selling author of 9 books, including Leadership and the New Science, and her newest book, Who Do We Choose to Be? Facing Reality, Claiming Leadership, Restoring Sanity. We hope this 2-part episode helps you consider, how do we choose to teach in a disruptive and post-COVID world? Welcome, Meg. Welcome to Unleashed Learning TV. I'm really excited you're here. We were talking earlier, and we're living in this world of disruption, chaos, in many ways collapse, which you've talked about. And what educators, which I was explaining before, what they're dealing with is one day they're online, one day they're face-to-face, now they're jumping here and there. And they're dealing with levels of uncertainty, disruption, like we all are. And what they've been asking and thinking about, they've been saying it to us, is what's post-COVID teaching going to look like, which we all don't know, but also asking, how do we navigate this time of disruption? And so I thought we would start the year with you.
And good timing.
Good timing. And so as I mentioned, your new book, I've, threaded.
Well, it's not new so much anymore. 2017. Yeah.
That's true. Well, it's new for
timely. Let's just say ever more timely.
Timely.
Or I could even say it was prescient.
Yeah. Timely is the right word. Timely is the right word. So in it, you say, I want to talk about islands of sanity, because you say that in the book that during times of disruption, during chaotic seas, it is possible to create some sanity with islands of sanity. So I thought we could start by asking you to just define what an island of sanity is.
Yes, that's easy. But I first want to say to everyone who's tuned in, I have long experience and deep affection for Australia. I have worked there numerous times, over a dozen times. I used to be there at least once or twice a year, working in many different places. The only major place I've never been is Perth. But I've worked in Alice, I've worked in the North, I've worked, of course, in the capital and in Queensland quite a lot, and worked with the Victoria Volunteer Fire Service. I mean, I really got around, and I miss it. But I have this deep connection. And I also am an educator. Now I'm educating in this way, but I began life as a public school teacher. Mm-hmm. Public means, you know what it means in American terms, and have consistently worked with teachers and administrators, because you're very much ground zero in many ways, in that people rely more and more on you to embed the values and the culture that increasingly is missing from families or from general society. And I've always felt that's a very unfair demand, but it, of course, my opinion doesn't lessen the reality that this is what people want from teachers. You kind of fill in all the gaps and are supposed to deal with all the problems at the same time, while youth experience greater and greater meaninglessness, desperation, suicide levels are going up, depression is a huge issue. And now on top of that, we have this terrible experience with needing to teach online. I work with one of the largest school districts in the country, in the US right now, about what they've done for online learning. So I'm giving this general context, and I want to say one more very depressing thing. We're now speaking about losing a whole generation of children, because achievement rates may look high, but an awful lot of children in my state of Utah in the Rocky Mountains, up to 50% of kids just didn't attend online learning, and they passed everyone. This applies to some of my grandchildren as well, because they can't evaluate learning and just want to keep momentum going for children. But what we've lost in terms of learning opportunities, and what the children have lost in terms of not only socialization in their relationships, but also their future, which is, we are dealing with uncertainty, and they're dealing with have no other context except now what's happening uh, to everything. What's going on here, people? So it's within that context I've just described what are really uh, constant turbulent seas, which we might say are pressures, but as they build up and they come together, then they create tsunamis, right? So a long time ago, I used to speak about how programs and initiatives that you've worked so hard to create and that are actually proven successful, that have evidence behind them that this works, suddenly they're gone because a politician doesn't like them, or because there's no more money, and suddenly funders say, well, we have to focus on something else. Uh, that was going on for a long time. Now, and now that every government that I know of, I don't know enough about Australian economy right now. I certainly have to say I despise many of your politicians who are just outrageous. But maybe that was always the case. But I don't know what your funding future looks like, but most of the developed countries now having to just support individuals, shore up businesses, keep things seemingly able to start up again. And I'm speaking about these dire situations in Europe and the US right now. We're in economic peril, and we're going to be seeing those consequences over the next several months. And so the future of funding for forward-thinking programs, for programs that have a 5-year view, even though they're based on evidence, it's looking very, very grim. So that's the sea of the turbulence, the potential for tsunami level forces of destruction, that you are trying to do your good work, your necessary work, your work of being with the children and helping them navigate this time with the prospect possibly of a better future, but that is really unknown at this point, because we're not even talking about climate.
Right.
And you've already experienced devastation last year, as we have in this out west where I live, from fires. Now we're in serious drought again. So this notion of islands of sanity is important now, because we are all suffering so greatly from the loss of capacity to do long-term programs, to be in anything except crisis mode. And I'm a systems thinker. That's what I was known for. That's what I still enjoy, is looking at complex systems and getting at root causes and seeing how things interact. But now I'm the proponent of creating a buffer, even a fortress, against these very destructive, turbulent forces. And what that buffer or island looks like is it has an intentional and conscious identity different than the crisis-laden, every person for themselves, people shifting into survival mode, motivated only by fear and self-protection. That's what we're seeing now, and that's a normal human response. Now, I know enough leaders and community people who, when they have experienced this level of breakdown in the past, because I've worked in Africa quite a bit, and I have colleagues who work in South America. So we know about cultures in collapse. We know about how these crises just destroy the ability to contribute in thoughtful and meaningful ways, to be even using rational decision making. So we know what it takes, and what it takes is a group of people and a very courageous leader. And this does require leadership now. This doesn't just happen to actually set up an identity that is different from the mainstream and to be very intentional about that, but also to make it known to everyone that I, as the leader, or we as a small group, are really consciously trying to prevent the onslaught, to keep back these very destructive dynamics, and therefore create the conditions where we can still work well together, take time to think together, take time to learn together, so that we can still serve, in this case, the children. So we used to call these communities of practice. They were always very rewarding. They were always the places where new ideas and new skill levels were born, and they were always self-organized. They didn't happen because the corporation, that's where they originated, in a corporate setting. They happened from the basic motivation of wanting to do a better and better job, and wanting to work with others who are in the same work. Well, what has happened with that now is that, given all the crises and given the fear that pushes people away, pushes us back, where I don't have time to participate, I don't have time to think, I just have to protect myself. That dynamic has taken over. It doesn't have to be that way. And so in the past, communities of practice were probably the right nomenclature, but I actually believe now it's much more intentional, much more difficult, and much more necessary to think of how are we going to create enough of a buffer that inside that buffer we can still take time to think. We can still engage in thoughtful conversations as colleagues, and we still, what's new about this is we know that this is the only way we will be able to do good work. This is the only way our work will still be meaningful. Because just think about your own lives now in your schools or administrative offices. Because how much time is given for thinking? I think I could guarantee an answer to that is close to zero. How much time is spent in reactivity, where feeling we just don't have time to deal with anything? And I was talking in Australia for many years about how to respond to chaotic situations, and the remedy always was find time to think together and make that sacrosanct time. That is one of the reasons we need to have this buffer, because if everyone is just responding to the next insane demand, they'll immediately say, because they've been saying this many years now, I just don't have time to think. You don't have time to think, then it's absolutely deterministic that you will go extinct. That's what we're doing as a species right now for many different reasons. But in organizations, we have to find time to think together so that we can respond with intelligence, rational behavior to this bombardment and this fear. The antidote to fear for people is good work together. And you could think about this in your own experience. You can be very emotionally charged. You can feel very fearful. And then you just have a good conversation with someone. What does that do for you? I mean, for me, it's the antidote to getting into this internal craziness of, oh my God, look how terrible things are. And I'm an American speaking to you at this time of our terrible, terrible violence that I believe is only going to increase. So my antidote for staying in fear is just get together with people, think together. And the moment we do that, this has always worked, but now it's life-saving. It's an antidote to fear. We've never had this much fear before. When we are together and we take the time, we carve it out, it's not a luxury. When we are committed to taking time together to still problem solve, to see what this recent crisis is and how we might do something intelligent as a reaction and do it together, then people move out of their fear. We move back into our frontal lobes. We start thinking again. And that is meaningful. And this is really important because we're so success oriented. Even if it doesn't work, we are still together. So we can handle the next crisis and the next crisis, the next insult, the next loss of funding. We can handle all that because we now have relationships. We can't come up with creative solutions if we're not working together. Every man for himself, every human for themselves is just suicide.
It's destroying us.
It really is. It's destroying whole nation states, and that's why I work with this great maxim from President Teddy Roosevelt: do what you can, where you are, with what you have. And just by working in that way, you're creating this clarity, this identity that we're going to work with what we have. We're here. We're going to work with each other. We're not looking for external resources because either they don't exist or they're very mercurial. They come and go. And as long as we have each other and as long as we spend time thinking together, I can guarantee that we will feel empowered. Even if things don't go our way and we're not successful with a program or an initiative, we still feel empowered. In fact, I was very touched. This is taking this up several levels of scale, because I was listening to Gorbachev, who, was responsible for the end of the Berlin Wall, the end of the breakup of the Soviet Union, really worked with peace initiatives, many of which were successful then, have since dissipated or disappeared. But in this interview, the interviewer asked him, well, what would you like on your tombstone? What should be written on your gravestone? And he said, I tried. I find that so touching. I tried. And then
it makes me think, and what you're saying with Islands of Sanity is we tried together.
Definitely.
We tried together.
And it is the being together that is the ultimate reward. So I very much promote, this is what I would like on, I won't have a gravestone, by the way. I'm going to have ashes scattered to the wind in places I value. But if I had a tombstone, it would be this quote of, we were together, I forget the rest. And at the end of our work, at the end of getting through any one crisis or terrible moment, there are many of those in front of us. Doesn't matter where you live right now. But when we've had the relationships, when we've stayed together, that's truly enough. And I'll also tell you a very funny story. I introduced that quote to a group of Catholic nuns about a year and a half ago. And these sisters are in their 70s and 80s. And I ended my presentation, as I sometimes do, with this very beautiful quote: we were together, I forget the rest. And at lunch, I went over to meet with the different nuns. And this one group said, we're glad you came over because we can remember the first part of that quote, but we can't remember the second. So
So, if I might, because you've answered some of the questions I was going to ask you, and I want to add another one is, can you give me an example? Because what I heard you say is, we should talk about communities of practice, and now islands of sanity might actually be the more accurate way to be thinking about this, about what's happening. So, would it be possible to give me an example, or give us an example of an island of sanity in action? What that might look like?
Well, what it looks like is a very active leader or a group, a small group, one of whose functions is it's real double duty because you are playing defense. You are keeping away destructive policies or these nonsensical decrees that come down from an administrative office, and you're filtering them. I mean, for an example, one of my star examples for all of this is a woman who ran a very large agency, a nonprofit NGO in Houston, Texas, Angela Blanchard, 62 community centers working on all sorts of issues. And one of the things they did was child care, our Head Start program. And they got into a lot of trouble over a stupid thing, but it's a federal program. And so the feds really came down on them and they kept asking for more and more verification, different program, just making sure really that they were obeying the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. And one day a staff member came in with the newest decree or request from Washington, D.C. And Angela just looked at that and she said, tell them no, we're not going to give it to them. We've given them enough. That's all we have. Tell them no. Well, the staff member was really terrified to call back and say no, right? But she did. And what happened then, and I've heard this in other examples, the person said, oh, okay, I guess we don't really need that anyway. I mean, when you're protecting this boundary, one of the constant assaults is from bureaucrats in distant offices who've lost all sight of purpose, the value of what you're doing as educators, and they just keep throwing these requests at you. And so one of the actions often is just saying, no, we can't do that. And then you get this, oh yeah, well, we don't really care about that anyway. But the other thing I'm seeing right now, and this is worth marking, as you're doing this boundary management, and I think that is what's new. A community of practice doesn't need a boundary manager. It doesn't need a filter. It doesn't need a defense strategy. What makes this an island is you have to very often create bigger and bigger walls. And so this incoming violence is increasing in the form that I see, at least in Europe, America, and South Africa, South America. Those are my examples right now of senior leaders or bureaucrats who want certainty. So they are pushing it down to mid-levels and saying, well, you need to guarantee outcomes. We want timelines, outcomes, strategic plans that anyone in their any moment of recognition knows that is impossible. I mean, during COVID, at the first wave, 40% of our top companies would not do budget projections, would not do any projections because it was just a big unknown. But what I'm seeing now, or at least I was seeing in the wintertime here, or summertime, is that the search for certainty has just been pushed down. So if people are going to fund you now, they want more guarantees of outcomes, more guarantees that what's the timeline here? What are the deliverables? I don't know what language you use, but that's our language. Um, and it's terrible to watch this, but one of the functions then of the leader of an island of sanity is um, to start pushing back and saying, we can give you this, but we're not going to give you that. And to realize that you are dealing across the boundary, you're dealing with fearful people who don't know what to do. But you do know what to do. And everything within the island, the other thing that is so important is the level of communication on the part of the leader to make sense of the chaos. And it's not that you can tell people exactly what's happening, but you can create a very clear policy that when I know it, you'll know it, which I've seen in a lot of disaster relief situations. Constant communication and paying exquisite attention to our relationships, knowing that we're going to get into the blame culture, we're going to come after each other, we're going to be really impatient. I mean, I just watch my own patience level day to day, working with people in my organization, my community. And there are just days when I feel dangerous. Like don't cross me around anything because I've just had it. I'm done. And so what do I do in those situations? I make sure I'm not in either contact with them, or I go for a walk, or I go do something different because I know I'm the one who's the problem with my impatience. So these are all personal experiences, but also examples of what it takes to be a truly courageous leader, where you have to keep the forces of destruction, which are these bureaucratic, fear-based policymakers and their directives. You have to keep them as much as you can away. And then you also have to pay attention to the quality of our relationships and our communication within the island.
I haven't thought of it in the ways you're saying now. And what I'm thinking, what I hear you saying is the leader has to know really what they're doing during these times. They have to understand what they're creating. And the second thing, I've never thought of it that way. The leader's role is to create the boundary for that island of sanity to exist and function. And so I was also thinking, and I can see maybe why you do the warrior work, because those leaders need to be around the other leaders that are doing that to keep themselves sane, because we can't do it alone.
Exactly.
You can't do that alone. You can't do that alone.
And it is a time. I have a podcast that I did for a servant leadership conference. And among other resources on my website, I would recommend that one, because it's not about just empowering people or engaging people. The role of leaders these days is much more dramatic, much more assertive, that you really have to be a leader. People, when they're confused, when they're in fear, they just don't know what to do. Now we see this dynamic with the rise of autocrats. Historically, it's always that way. You put people in fear, and then you, as the demagogue, are the solution, right? That's American history right there, current American history. But it's happening in so many places in the world, and it's happened in the past. So what we really need is enlightened leadership. And when I talk about warriors for the human spirit, we can go into that detail. But you have to claim the role of leader at this point. And it's a very exhausting job, and it's very necessary if we're going to make any progress, any sense out of this continuing chaos and uncertainty. And as the future gets more uncertain, which I would guarantee it's doing that in front of us, the role of leaders really has to be much more conscious and determined, and we step into it. We assume it. That's the new form of servant leadership.
I have one last question, but I want to just throw something in that's making me think about it. I've been saying when you introduced Islands of Sanity, at least when I read it, I was starting to, and I didn't have that language, but I've been telling educators for many years that your classroom or learning space, and I didn't use this language, but lately I am, is an island of sanity for the people in that room, or can be an island of sanity for the people in that room. And so for some educators, and myself included, it's helped them see their classroom, the community they build inside that classroom, as more than content delivery, but actually creating an island of sanity for young people, and keeping the bounds out the way you're describing that. Yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out because that's how I'm thinking about it a bit for educators and they're actually classroom.
And I think if you take the classroom as the unit, for any of us as educators, how has our own knowledge and wisdom of what makes for a good learning environment been affected or deteriorates because of curriculum demands, certification demands, testing demands? I know it's very different on Australia still, because a few years ago when I was working with some Australian educators, they went on a study tour of American schools and they came back and said, wow, American teachers are just frantic. And that was a mild description of the impact of huge levels of testing, standardization on American school teachers. But think about, in your own experience as a teacher, when have you had to take a stand? When have you had to say, well, I know that's policy, or I know that's what you expect from me, but my own knowledge and experience as a teacher says that in order to create a good learning environment, this is what I have to do. And in that way, you've probably already been a warrior for the human spirit, for the spirit of learning with children.
Well, the last question I want to ask you for this episode is, you talk about, learning systems or living systems. And I'm curious, where does learning fit, which you've alluded to, maybe I've alluded to, but in an island of sanity, where does learning fit for that system, for that group of warriors, really? But how do you see that at this time?
Well, let me tell you my favorite story, which was when I was working for the head of the U.S. Army, which was a real game changer for me in my own career as a woman. I got so much respect once with 4-star generals who were willing to learn from me, And I was out at a battle, a mock battle that involved hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers. And it was there that I learned, and it's the process I described in Who Do We Choose to Be, of an after-action review, where I had never seen so much learning in place. After something significant happened, you gathered together all those who were involved, and you asked everyone for their perspective of what happened here. And rank was not a determinant, status, role. You just wanted to learn what happened so you could learn from it and not make the same mistake again. And so after watching this mock battle for several hours, I was having coffee in a little Army cafe with a colonel. And I said, this is the first learning organization I've ever been in. And it's remarkable to me. And he just smiled and he said, well, Meg, we learned this one a long time ago. It's better to learn than be dead. And living systems are constantly adapting, which means they are taking in information from their environment and making changes so they survive. That's just what evolution is about. It's not about progress, it's about survival. And the insanity of humans right now as a species on the planet is how we think we can just do what we damn well please. We will shape the environment to fit our needs and wants, and we don't have to learn from experience. I mean, my Buddhist teacher said, he said, there's only one thing true in life. Life always gives you feedback. You always get feedback. So then the question is, do we learn from it? So, learning isn't happening in the greater turbulent sea, but on an island of sanity, the way we maintain ourselves and prepare for the next onslaught of insanity is by learning and learning together. So there's no distinction. I mean, it was Fritjof Capra, the great physicist and dear friend of mine, who said a living system is a learning system, and living and learning are direct synonyms. They're exactly the same thing until you get to how we manifest in modern society, where we don't learn, we just keep doing.
And it seems like then from that description, because if the leader's role of creating an island of sanity is to keep the boundary, part of the boundary is to give the team, the group, time for learning, because everybody wants it in 13 minutes. So they have to actually keep the boundary and the space for the learning to take place. So I was thinking that now as you're describing it, the leader has to actually carve out the space, hold the space, keep things away to allow the learning time to actually be happening for that island of sanity.
That's absolute. You got it. And it's very exhausting work, but it's also work that people thank you for doing. But it's war. It's warfare. Like we have to or it's keeping the flood away. We have to make sure the dikes, the levees are strong enough. And sometimes you have a lot of time to think, and sometimes you have 15 minutes. But that's why you want to also develop the competence, the survival competence. We can think together quickly. We can gather together for 15 minutes and make sense of something. You do develop that skill. And it really is. I mean, more and more, I do see it, unfortunately, as a bunker mentality. But we're still trying to do good work. Still trying to educate children and deal with the increasing fear and uncertainty that is in the children and in the parents and in everyone. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to pause, because we're going to go to warriorship for part 2. And I think people listening need time to process and learn and consider and think. So let me say thank you for part 1. And we'll come back for part 2, and we're going to talk about warriorship.
Wonderful.
Okay, we'll see you in a minute. Thanks, Meg.